This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Hi, I am Jessica Dixon Weaver. I'm an assistant professor at Southern Methodist University Dedman School of Law. I'm in my 4th year on tenure track, and I teach family law, children in the law, and professional responsibility. I received my Bachelor of Arts from University of Pennsylvania and my Juris Doctorate from the University of Virginia. My primary research areas are children, or the child welfare law and policy reform, and the intersection of family structure, race, and gender. I developed my research interest from my practice of law and my experiences practicing law. I began my career out of law school working in a labor and employment law firm in Dallas, Texas. And I actually failed the Texas bar the first 2 times, which resulted in my loss of that job. On my 3rd try, I did pass the bar, and I began working at another small law firm. And I discovered that if I really wanted to learn what it was like to be a litigator, I would need to practice on my own. So I branched out and started my own solo practice 2 years out of law school in 1997. And I saw it as a way for me to create my own destiny in the law. I continued to practice labor and employment from the plaintiff's side, doing employment discrimination, termination, and sexual harassment cases, but I also chose to enter into the field of family law and children in the law specifically. It stemmed primarily from my interest in wanting to give back to my community and not having enough time as a busy lawyer to do the traditional community service, and so I saw representing children as a way for me to give back to my community. The pay was very low, so it was almost like working for free. But I found that I really developed a passion for representing children, and I learned a lot representing kids in the juvenile justice system as well as kids who had been abused and neglected. So I developed so much of a love for that I really just wanted to do that full time, but it was very difficult to do that just in solo practice. You always had to combine different areas in order to make a living. The position came open at SMU Dedman School of Law for director of their new child advocacy clinic. And I was determined to get that job because it was a dream job for me just to be able to do that and that alone. I applied, I got the job, and I began to put together an interdisciplinary clinic for students, and I ran that clinic for 7 years. In the midst of that, because I was able to focus on one area of law and to reflect on some of my experiences as a practitioner and also as a supervisor of students, I was able to put together a couple of conferences as well as a community advisory group. And in doing those things, my research interest developed from those 2 conferences. One of the conferences focused on the failures of the foster care system to serve children's best interest, and the other focused on racial disproportionality or the overrepresentation of African American children in the child welfare system. So my first article, the African American Child Welfare Act, a legal redress for African American disproportionality in child protection cases, came out of that second symposium that I organized. There were 2 other articles that came out of my work in the clinic. The Texas Misstep, Why the Largest Removal in U.S. History Failed, and the Principle of Subsidiarity, Reforming the Legal Framework to Capture the Psychological Abuse of Children. And those 2 articles came out of the case in Texas in 2008 where there were over 400 children removed from the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints of Christ compound that was in San Angelo, Texas. So while our clinic students didn't provide direct representation for those children, the State Bar of Texas and the family law section of various different counties came together to provide legal representation for all of those children in our clinic. Or I put together a full-day seminar to train those attorneys who had not had any training in representing children in abuse and neglect cases. So in my observations and talking with different attorneys who did provide representation, I began writing those 2 articles. I believe theory and theorists influence the law and how lawyers interpret the law. The theories that we learn in law schools and that we teach our students are often the lens through which we see cases as lawyers in real time, and also the facts surrounding those cases. I think theorists also support policies. I am a practitioner by training, so that's the first way that I think is as a lawyer who's in practice. But after switching to tenure track in 2009, I began, considering how theories applied to the law and how they applied to the types of reforms that I wanted to write about in my articles. So one of the things that I wrote about in the past was the ideology of the 2-parent home, and with the father as provider and mother as nurturer. And Martha Feynman has written about this a lot as far as in her work in talking about motherhood. But I talk about this in it's a small article called it's called The First Father, Perspectives on the President's Fatherhood Initiative, and it looks at how Senator Patrick Moynihan's The Case for the Negro Family, which was referred to as the Moynihan Report, influenced the fatherhood initiative that Presidents William Clinton, George Bush, and now President Obama have put into place in order to address the issue of absentee fathers in the home. And I talk about how Patrick Moynihan's report really identified single mothers as the problem in the Black family, or matriarch homes, and so opposite of patriarch, with having a man in the home as the nurturer and as the provider. Because these homes were absent of fathers, this was why there was such a decline in the Black family, linking that to poverty and all types of other issues with regard to teenage pregnancy, dependency, and those types of things. In the article, I talk about how that lens or that ideology is really racialized in the sense, in the President's Initiative as well, because it generally focuses on low-income fathers, urban fathers, which is really a synonym for Black and brown fathers. And so their focus is on absent Black and brown fathers, and their focus is also on marriage. And there's as much money dedicated towards the healthy marriage component of the President's Fatherhood Initiative as there is on the father. And I found that there was very little or very few ways where they can assess the true issue behind putting this presidential initiative in place, which is to improve children's well-being. And so there's been a lot of money, billions of dollars spent on this President's Fatherhood Initiative, but as far as what it has meant for families, there's not a lot of concrete empirical evidence to show for that. As well, I think that there's not a focus on the meaning of father, because we know from different scholars like Solangelo Maldonado that even though Black and brown fathers might not be paying child support, they actually are present in their children's lives in many ways, visiting and providing other things, but it's not necessarily governed or documented by the state. And so efforts that this initiative have made towards making sure that men pay their child support, sort of putting fathers back in the role of being provider and marking that as the way for fathers to be integrated into their children's lives, don't necessarily compute in real time, with regard to the fact that it drives fathers underground, whereas before they might have been present, now they're hiding from the families because they know that they're being sought after to be put on the payroll with regard to child support. The other thing that I write about with regard to theory and how it applies to practice is focuses on African American grandmothers. So there was an essay response that I wrote in response to scholar Beth Ritchie, and she's not a legal scholar, but she's a sociology professor, and she writes about the gender entrapment theory of domestic or battered women who are incarcerated. And she has done many studies on both different race women who were incarcerated, both white and black primarily, and comparing sort of their experience as being battered women and how that influenced the crimes that they committed and how they conceived a family, and how it affected their own family as far as their children and spouse or partner. And part of what I looked at was how their actions were molded by their primary family, and then also how those mothers of the women who are incarcerated are obligated to take care of their children. And so whether or not the gender entrapment theory recycles, with the next generation, and looking at how in many ways those African American grandmothers are entrapped as well in the same neighborhoods with the same dynamics as their daughters, and sort of looking at how they view marriage and coupling with men, whether it's in living together or getting married, and how they raise their children in sort of a kinship network. And most of the time it's usually without men as a primary supporter, and talking about how domestic violence, or that experience of domestic violence, influences them not to enter into relationships with men in an older age when they're more financially stable, and perhaps the man may not be, and so they end up supporting the man and the grandchildren, and the choice to remain single so that they can remain financially viable for their grandchildren, as well as not getting into another situation of domestic violence. And so it was interesting to me to see the correlations between the mothers and the grandmothers and how that impacted, or if it impacted children. One of the ways that I saw how her theory could apply to practice was looking at how law schools could form clinics that would serve those women in jail, in the sense that the women who are incarcerated, regardless of race, should have a way in order to plan their family and the custody of their children prior to going into jail or once they get to jail. And usually that's not done at all. It's sort of, the kids go wherever they can go, and those persons who are custodians are not legal custodians, under the law, and they usually can't access a lot of the services and benefits that the mom could if they needed assistance from the government. And so if there were a way for those parents to define legally who they wanted to care for their children, as well as visitation, because that's the other thing that oftentimes is problematic for grandmothers, is having the money to transport the grandkids back and forth, and somehow pooling resources in order to assist with the ongoing relationship between incarcerated mothers and their children. As a side note, one of my students actually started a nonprofit called GEM, which stands for Girls Embracing Mothers, and her mother went to jail. Although she wasn't a minor when her mom went to jail, she started this program in order to build sort of a coalition in the community to help these girls as their moms were away, and so helping them with growing up, dealing with issues, and also assisting the moms and the daughters in maintaining the communication and maintaining their relationships. So I think in many ways, you can use theory to look at how are we, practicing law, how can we benefit women who are incarcerated, or persons who are incarcerated, and their children, and how even with law students, from law students to lawyers to the community, come around people who are in a situation that they, obviously didn't plan for their families, but how we can help in that way. And I think it's important for us to look to theory in order to help our practice. And I also think that practice typically influences theory. So it's sort of like an arts imitates life situation oftentimes, because your practice, my practice at least, in representing children definitely influences how I think about what the law should look like. And then once I look at other people's theories about the law, it helps me either develop my own or apply that theory to what I'm thinking about. So the gender entrapment theory that Beth Ritchie talks about in her book, Compelled to Crime, is basically the theory that the socialization of girls in their home families, their primary families, leads them to enter into relationships where they become battered women. And when they become battered women and their locus of control is not their own, they are more apt to commit crimes depending on what their spouse influences them to do, or their partner. And so many of the crimes that they do are not violent crimes or property crimes or drug crimes, and sometimes it's just that they're in the wrong place at the wrong time with a man who is committing a crime also, and so they, by default are incarcerated also. So she looks at the differences between how black girls are raised in their homes versus white girls, and how that's different, and by interviewing different women in jail. And it seems as though, and I'm generalizing, so white children often grow up with the expectation that they are subject to men and that they are subordinate in a way that, that they should do as they're told. Sort of like this is the way of things, and so don't rock the boat. And black children or black girls are socialized to think that they are very, very special, and that everything is open to them. They're sort of geared towards doing well in school and taking on different responsibilities in the home that are more adult-like. And when they grow up and realize that life is not, they are not as special as what their parents have told them that they are, and they can't do everything that they'd like to do, they're marginalized within their employment or work community. And when they come back to their home community, they're seeking that feeling of you're special. And so they seek that from men. And the men that typically are batterers do a lot of that, you're special, and then there's hitting, and they stay. And the impetus to stay is sort of where race comes in, as far as black women being socialized to stand behind their man, don't make him feel any worse than the outside world already makes him feel with regard to discrimination and racist issues that they may, encounter in their work world or in their life. And so the support mechanism is always the woman, and so to fall behind, whatever it is that he's telling you to do, because you should support him at all cost. So it's an interesting dynamic that creates the same situation for both women, but a different socialization. So I have to say that, well, first they do, feminist legal theory and cultural theory have a huge influence on legal studies, as well as in my work, or on my work. When I first started writing, I didn't associate myself with feminist. I just saw myself and the law through the lens in which I was raised, and I was always raised to be conscious of my world around me and how other people fit in the world. And because I grew up in the South, and as an African American girl in the South, obviously it was a racial lens, it was a female lens, and I had very strong women in my family as well as very strong men. The practice of law definitely trained me to always put things in context, and I think that feminist theorists always do provide a context for things, whether it's a patriarchal context or another type of context, depending on whether it's critical race or ecology. And because I'm a lawyer, I also was trained to tell stories. And so putting the narrative in and fitting in where women fall, in the law and in society is definitely something that comes very natural to me. So when I started reading the work of feminists like Martha Fineman and Nancy Dowd and Joan Williams, it resonated with me, and I was like, yeah, this is definitely who I am as well. But I also identify with critical race feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw and Adrienne Davis and Angela Harris, because I have the multiple consciousness of sorts. And then with regard to children in the law, I think most children in the law scholars definitely have a culture or come from a cultural theorist background, because we understand that the children that are part of that system often are not majority culture. They often are African American and brown kids. And the women and families are also, not majority culture. And so there's a certain cultural competence that comes with even definitely the practice of the law, but also the theory of the law. So Barbara Bennett Woodhouse and Annette Appel and Dorothy Roberts have definitely influenced me in how I look at the child welfare system through theoretical lenses now, as opposed to sort of just in my practice, this is what I think. I think it's also important to use cultural theory and feminist theory in teaching students. And it's interesting, I think students definitely identify you as you're a feminist, or you support certain things based on what you look like. And sometimes those assumptions are true and sometimes they're not. But I do think it's important for them to read different work, out of the context of their case books, or that we, give them to read on their own, in order for them to look at things from a different lens, because most lawyers, in the past have been men, and so I think that the law has been written, with that lens in place. I mean, we see that kind of play out in a lot of different ways, with healthcare, with the 2012 presidential elections. Everything is sort of looked at from different lenses, and I think it's important for students at least to see that there are different lenses, and they can choose whichever one that they want to see or use for themselves, but they should be presented with those theories from different scholars. So the concepts of vulnerability and embodiment inform my work in many ways. I have an article that I'm currently working on that will be published in 2013, entitled Grandma in the White House. And in that article, I talk about the vulnerability of both children and elderly. The article is primarily about the ways in which law discourages grandmothers from intergenerational caregiving, and in some instances, multi-generational living. And I explore the ways in which tax, housing, and employment laws are not conducive for grandmothers and puts them in a negative situation with regard to performing care work for their families. I talk about there being an entrance convergence of both children and elderly, in the sense that they obviously are vulnerable in different ways. So we all are dependent, and Professor Feynman talks about that dependency and the vulnerability of human beings just by being human, by the virtue of our condition of humanity, that there will always be a time when we will need some help, and some help from the state itself. So in looking at these two situations where children need care in the very beginning of their lives when they are dependent on mothers or parents, and elderly need help at the end of their lives, and how can these two things work together? And I look at both how culture influences that and how we value our elders in various cultures, and how we really have a cultural tradition of placing elders with children in order for them to sort of retribe or pass along tradition and culture to those children as they grow up, and also just to teach them and how they typically have a special relationship between grandparent and grandchild. But I also look at the ways in which the state can assist grandparents by some changes in employment laws such as FMLA, which is Family Medical Leave Act, and allowing for the definition of who is family to include grandparents so that grandparents can take time off from work in order to care for their grandchildren. In addition to that, how the act should allow for more than just leave for serious medical illnesses, so that routine things like, taking children to doctor or going to children's events at their school, being supportive of your child or grandchild is something that is allowed by law for people who are working Americans. And because our society is aging at such a rapid rate, we have a large number of baby boomers who are entering into senior citizenship. They're active, they're still working, and so when they opt to either leave the workforce, and these are primarily women who opt to leave the workforce or quit altogether, that impacts their ability to take care of themselves in the future financially. It reduces their Social Security, it reduces their pensions, and we know now that the average age of grandparents, first-time grandparenthood is like between 46 and 48. So much younger than it has been in the past. And so people are generally in the primary part of their work career at that point. And so the article really looks at sort of how we can serve those working mothers who are not in a career where they have flexibility, but where they are typically looked to by their family members to help in care work, but where it would be beneficial for them to continue to work in order to support themselves as they age and as people age and continue to live longer lives, because that's the other trend with having such a large number of senior citizens. We also have a large number of senior citizens living to longer age. So we have a high number of persons who reach 100 or 95. So that means that their money, the money that they did save for retirement may go a shorter distance and not actually take care of them through the end of their lives, and they will need family as well to help as they become older and more dependent on family. So I talk about the ways in that instance where multi-generational living can be of service, and how the government or the state can be responsive in a way by allowing for instance, accessory dwelling units, which are called ADUs. So it's giving people the ability to add on to their home without a lot of legal red tape in order to get there. Also in other countries, I reference how in Canada the government allows for monetary sort of grants for that type of housing, so that people can apply for that and add on to their home and bring their parent or grandparent to the children into the home. So these are ways that we will have to look at in the future, because we have no other choice. As we have more senior citizens, we will need more housing. And it's important for, I think, families to be able to serve one another, and for the state to be responsive in that way. So I think vulnerability and the theory that Professor Feynman purports is valuable to that work, especially with regard to how will it be paid for, and looking at, well, are we always valuing the efficiency or the economy of how we provide services to the public, or should we look at, the good, the social good that comes out of it, or the good for children? Because there's obviously different ways in which grandparenting and care for children by family members prevents lots of things like substance abuse, teenage pregnancy, juvenile delinquency. So when you have more eyes, more people who are caring for kids, you have less, influenced by other things, other societal influences that would, take them down a road that would be less beneficial, which would mean they would be not productive citizens. So it influenced that article in that way. The article that I'm actually working on here in the research that I'm doing with the Feminist Legal Theory Project and the Vulnerability and the Human Condition Initiative is child sexual victimization when abused children become neglectful mothers. And when I first came, I wasn't sure which theory I would use, but I was looking for sort of a theoretical approach to how I would talk about this issue. This article also came out of my work in the clinic because I noticed a trend where there were about 70% of the mothers that I dealt with in cases over 15 years had that in their background, child sexual victimization, and usually it was untreated and they were disclosing maybe for the first time within the child welfare system as mothers. And I just thought, maybe there's a connection here that we should be looking at, and how can we deal with these mothers without stigmatizing them as bad mothers, but also addressing the trauma that they had early in their lives that may have been part of the reason why they grew up to be a neglectful mother. So some of the ways that I've been looking at since I've been here as far as vulnerability impacting my work is looking at how humans are vulnerable in many ways, and the prevalence of child sexual abuse and the fact that this could happen to anyone at any time, no matter what their race or socioeconomic situation. I have been in contact during my time here with different faculty affiliates of the Vulnerability and Human Condition Initiative, primary doctors and psychologists. And so they're specializing in child sexual abuse, and their work with families and children has helped me to see some of the assumptions that I have in my own work, and forced me to question whether or not I'm approaching this in the right way. So I think the fact that I now have more, even though it was very prevalent, or it is very prevalent in the child welfare system, it is definitely prevalent across the board. One of the doctors that I met with said that out of the children that she provides therapy for, half of their mothers have been sexually abused as well. So 1 in 2 of the mothers of child sexual abuse victims that are at least in therapy have been abused themselves, which is a really large number. The number as far as children who have been sexually abused is typically known as 1 in 4. That's 25% of our population. And if you think about, okay, well, even if half of them disclosed, half of those mothers have experienced it. So it's a huge issue. And I wasn't aware, I was aware, but it didn't really dawn on me how that would influence, what I'm writing and my legal approach to things. In another way, I think the vulnerability thesis provides a basis for state institutions to be more active in preventative measures. And so one of the ideas that I had in looking at how often these women were encountered by the state was putting together a universal screening process. So whenever there's a risk factor, say for instance a teen pregnancy or substance abuse or a runaway, then those women or girls would be screened and to ask about, have you had the experience of child sexual abuse in your home? And in doing that, giving those girls a way to get therapy before they become mothers, or even if they are pregnant, before they have children. And so preventing the neglect or abuse of children on the front end. And I think the vulnerability theory does help with that, in the sense that if the state has a responsibility for humans at all times, it should have the responsibility for them, before they even come into fruition. So helping to prevent child sexual abuse as well. And I think it also goes beyond victimization of a certain group. And so to the extent that we see child sexual abuse survivors as victims, it takes them out of that victimhood and recognizes that there are lifetime implications for this circumstance. And so, yes, they may need therapy as children, but they also may need therapy as adults. So to the extent that they experience post-traumatic stress disorder, yes, I said that right, they might need help or therapy when they become adults, when they have their own children. And so if there's a recognition that at all times, in their lives when they are vulnerable, they can access this, I think that's helpful for them, because it would also, again, prevent this cycle of child abuse from occurring again. So I have some other things that I could say about that, but I'll stop now. So my focus on intergenerational caregiving and family structure has been influenced by my own family experience. And my relationship with my mother is a very good one, as most daughters and mothers clash, but I did have a very strong relationship with my paternal grandmother. She provided after school care for me, and I walked home from my middle school to her home, where she provided me dinner every night, and I practiced the piano, and she sort of taught me how to be a young lady. And you know, she was very influential in the sense of my religious faith, and always emphasizing that we should go to church. And she was a librarian, so she definitely influenced us to read. And she was constantly writing out ideas. So I guess I saw her as definitely a role model for me. And she was a strict disciplinarian, but she was also very loving. And she was a support for my mother, because my mother worked until 6 p.m. She couldn't pick me up from school. So she knew I was safe there. I was well taken care of. And so it was definitely sort of bridging the gap there, where she didn't have money to care for, you know, to pay for after school care. And I actually don't think there was after school care at that time. When I was growing up. So I had a relationship with my paternal grandmother, but not my maternal grandmother, because my maternal grandmother lost her parental rights. So my mom was actually raised in foster care, and there were 10 children. And I actually do want to write an article about the narratives of my mother's family eventually, because I think it's a very good example of how the foster care system worked then and how it works now, and some of the changes that have been put in place, and some of the changes that we still need to do with regard to sibling relationships and the importance of sibling relationships. Because I didn't have a relationship with my maternal grandmother, I did have relationships with my aunts and uncles. And my mom was placed with her sister in foster care. And at that time in the state of Ohio, which is where she grew up, they did not have sibling visitation or a mandate for sibling visitation. So they really were not allowed to visit with their siblings. There was no fostering of that. So the 10 children that my grandmother had, you know, they were split up into different homes. And so the only way that they saw each other was either at school or through their Aunt Pauline. So for whatever reason, the state did allow the kids to go see their Aunt Pauline all together sometimes. And so they would have these periodic visits with her where they would all be together, and, you know, they formed this bond. And my uncle was really the oldest child, who remembers, you know, the circumstances of them coming into care, and it mostly was neglect. And there were 2 children that actually were adopted, and one had an open adoption, so he knew who his family was, but the youngest girl did not. It was a closed adoption. So my uncle petitioned the court in order to open up her adoption so that she would know that she had 9 other siblings. So they did grant that, and they had a big reunion in California where she lives so that she would know who her other siblings were. So it was interesting for me to find out this history, because I had already actually started working in this area before really delving into it. I knew my mom had grown up in foster care, but I had never really asked the questions. And so after I started asking the questions, I learned that my aunts and uncles experienced some of the same things that the kids in foster care now experience. They were abused in their home. One of my aunts was sexually abused, and her first child was fathered by her foster father. So I had no idea about that, you know, so it was one of those things. It's like, oh gosh, this is still happening now. But at the same time, we do have laws now that support sibling visitation. And my mother's story, which I didn't know altogether, when she was the only child out of the 10 to go to college, and she put herself through college. But when she aged out at 18, of course, you have to leave your foster parents' home. So when she left, she went to go to live with her siblings, who were already adults. And if they hadn't been there for her, she really would have been homeless. So they provided her with room and board, and she paid for her way through college. And so they were very key and instrumental to, you know, at least all of them becoming viable citizens. None of them ended up in jail. None of them ended up on drugs, you know, which is usually the plight of a lot of foster care children today, they don't grow up to have, meaningful, productive lives because of all of the issues that they had. So, it seemed as though something was done right, at least during that time period, but there were a lot of things that were done wrong too. So I want to explore through narratives, what their life was like growing up, and look at sort of the lives of what foster children now, and compare the two and see, what is it about our system that we're doing right, and what is it that we're doing wrong, and what do we need to change. So I think it's really important, which kind of goes back to my work about, stressing the importance of children's voices and listening to children, which is something that we don't often do as lawyers. I mean, we represent them, we represent their best interests, but we don't actually go back and talk to them. And so I want to make that an integral part of what I do in my scholarship, because I think it's important for them to finally have a voice. And it's nice to see there are some law students who have been in the foster care system now, or some social workers who have grown up in the foster care system, and so they're able to use their experience in helping better their situation and the situation of other kids. So I think that's really important. But yeah, it's kind of like full circle for me to be doing what I'm doing, and I can't wait to get all my narratives together and do that story. Hopefully it'll be a book.